Okay, so another language difference. I'm more of a Mac person. Anyway, thank you for allowing me to address you. It's a great honor. I'm also grateful to the Pueblo for the caretakers of this land, for allowing me to be here to speak today. So, as Ine said, I'm going to give you a little bit of my background. So I'm a non-native person, but I've worked for over 20 years now to help maintain indigenous languages in the US and throughout the world. I founded the Endangered Language Fund, I guess that's 22 years ago now. I directed the Documenting Endangered Languages program of the National Science Foundation, which has funded some of you, I know. I did that for 2 years. And in that time, I have developed a different perspective on language revitalization than what I started out with. I knew all along that it was heroic work to do language revitalization, but the perspective of how it affects health is one that did not occur to me until relatively recently. So I wanted to share that perspective with you. So, if I can get this to... So this is the website for the Endangered Language Fund. ELF.org had been snatched up early on. We couldn't grab that, so we have the moderately annoying URL. It's not nearly as annoying as the URL for the National Science Foundation, but, well, that's government for you. When we're approaching a language revitalization effort, it pays to think very hard about what you're planning to do, because it is hard. I try to be balanced in my assessment of things. I think language revitalization is important. I also acknowledge that it's hard. And that's true even when you are quite dedicated. It's just, there's a lot that has to go into it. So why do you do it? The late Darrell Kipp was fond of saying you could always find somebody to tell you that it's not going to work. That's easy. Somebody is always ready to say, well, I'm sorry, that's just not going to work, or it's not worth it. And if you're going to do it, you just have to ignore those people and go ahead and do it. So, of course, there are many reasons for revitalizing a language or maintaining a language, but today I'm going to talk about the health implications. And this comes in the face of various other community challenges, which I know I don't need to remind you of particularly, but I'll just point them out anyway. So all of these, sovereignty, safety, land, employment, health, and maintaining culture, are all challenges that all of your communities face. And these are all important challenges, and they all require efforts, massive or less massive, but mostly massive efforts to get the right outcome. So in some ways it seems that language might not be an important component of this. So it is seldom the case that language immediately leaps out as being the solution to one or more of these problems. In particular, language is part of culture, but as you know, it's not absolutely necessary for it. It's possible to maintain native culture without being a native speaker. And we know that from not just Native American cultures, but cultures all over the world where people do manage to maintain their language despite having switched or been forced to switch to a majority language. Nonetheless, if you do maintain your language, it is an amazingly efficient means of maintaining a culture. It's very hard to speak a language and not appreciate the culture that gave rise to it. And in particular, if you look at cultural activities, it's not the case that everybody is going to want to do baskets or canoes or singing or whatever other cultural endeavor you might think of, but language can inform any of those and all of those. And so having a language program is just a very efficient means of keeping everybody involved in the culture. So because of this connection, this tight connection with culture, it is, I believe, the case that, that many revitalization programs do end up in the culture departments of the supporting tribes. And as you know, and as I said earlier on, other issues often seem far more urgent than culture does. If your land is being taken away from you and you're about to be dispossessed, you're not going to expend a lot of effort learning the next verb form. But nonetheless, that just means that language programs often end up being kind of an afterthought in the funding scheme. And even though there are clear reasons why this happens, it has the unfortunate side effect that many language programs end up being very restricted and in some cases being canceled altogether. If we start thinking of language programs as a social service, things start to change around a little bit. The communities that I've talked to, and I have not yet found one that doesn't feel this way, don't start their language programs to satisfy linguists like myself who like to see lots of languages because each language is really different and interesting from all the other languages. I have to confess that I do feel that way. I'm a linguist, I can't help myself. I just find languages really interesting. So I like having lots of languages around, but I would never recommend that as a reason for maintaining a language. The language has to be maintained because it serves the community that's maintaining it. And so many communities have decided that maintaining the language is indeed an essential part of their culture, and that's why they want to maintain it. So that is marvelous on many levels, but it turns out to have health benefits, and that's what I'm talking about today. It is somewhat surprising, but the evidence is quite strong that language programs have health benefits. I'm going to be focusing on physical health. I believe that there are probably equal improvements in mental health, but surveying the physical health literature was daunting enough, and I didn't have time to survey the mental health literature as well, as important as it is. So if language programs have health benefits and we don't treat them as health programs, I believe we're underselling them. If your language program is improving the health of the members who participate in it, and you don't point that out to people, you're underselling your program. So that's my main theme for the day. This thinking really came about from a visit I made to New Zealand in 2008, and I had the honor of meeting with Dame Ira Tawhiwhirangi, one of the founders of the Language Nest programs. And here she is in front of one of the traditional Maori community houses. And she discussed how many of the early challenges to the program included a request from the government that after the first year that they evaluate the success of the program. And this was because the Maori government or the New Zealand government had provided some money for the program. Certainly not enough money, but they had provided some money. And like most governments, if they contribute a dime, they think they own it. So they insisted that she evaluate the program after its first year, and she said no. I'm fairly certain she banged her fist on the table. And basically there were two reasons. First was a year is not nearly enough time to establish a program, much less evaluate it. But secondly, the mainstream programs are never evaluated. When did the New Zealand government ever go off and insist that its regular education programs be evaluated? Pretty much never. It's a little bit, I have sympathy for people because evaluation is hard, but nonetheless, it was this, again, a double standard for a new program that it had to prove itself while the business as usual model did not have to prove itself, whether it was successful or not. So because she was a force of nature, she did in fact prevail. So one thing that she pointed out was that the outcome of the language programs was not necessarily obvious. So as I walked around the streets of Wellington, I never heard Maori being spoken on the streets. I was only there for a few days, so that's not to say it doesn't happen, but it certainly was not something where this had become the majority of what was going on. But this did not strike her as a severe limitation. Her people had come back from the brink of extinction. And this time, at least, it was due to alcohol, drugs, and various other health issues. And the language nests and the language program were not the only component of this revival, of course, but they were a very critical part of it. And so once you look at a language program from that perspective, you don't have to say, well, it's a failure because people aren't going around chatting in Maori. If it saves a people, surely that's a success. So that's something that I found very powerful and that I took away from my visit. And it opened my eyes to what was happening with other programs throughout, particularly this country, but throughout the world. So what I'm going to talk about today is language maintenance and revival programs. This is excluding those cases where people have tried to take materials about health and instructions from doctors and so forth and translating it into local languages. In places like Mexico, this is often more of an issue because there are sizable communities that have monolingual native speakers. In the US, that's pretty much no longer true. So it's a relatively small part of the issue. So I'm going to focus on the effects of overt language teaching programs and their effect on health. So the evidence is going to come from published results. And this is a focus of mine for two reasons that I guess I didn't really put down here. First of all, I'm a scientist. I can't help myself. I like published results. But also, I knew that to generate serious money, the serious money is controlled by people who also believe in published reports. Foundations, the National Institutes of Health, which I'll get to later on in the talk, they want to see published evidence that something is effective, and then they're willing to support it. So to me, having scientific studies available and accessible in a digested form, so some kind of summary statement, was really important. Like all scientific studies, these are incomplete. No scientific study tells you everything about a particular thing. As a scientist, I'm also quite used to that, but sometimes people get too wrapped up in a single study and ignore the larger picture. But we wanted to put together as much evidence as we could find for the effectiveness of language programs on the community members' health. So along with Margaret Moss and Daryl Baldwin, we published a survey on as much of the literature as we could find. And that's in the references that'll be at the end of the talk. So I'm going to discuss the studies that we found there, a few that have come out since we did publish that study, and also some contradictory results that have come out even more recently. So one thing that we found was that there just weren't very many studies. And that's upsetting in some ways because one would like to have more studies to look at. Because if you're putting together evidence, you'd like to have lots of evidence. On the other hand, it's not really that surprising because only a couple of language programs have been around for more than 30 years, basically the Maori and the Hawaiian, assuming that you discount Hebrew, which was really successful. But of course, it didn't used to be that communities needed language programs. Language was taught at the cradle board and on up, and you didn't have to think about it. People just learned their language. That's the marvelous victory of human language, that our kids just learn it. You don't have to go around sending them to school to learn their language. They just do it. So it didn't used to be that language programs even needed to exist. So they didn't. Lately, as we become to recognize the severe loss that's going on with languages, more and more language programs have been developed. So there haven't been programs around long enough to do very many studies. And even for the two that I mentioned, the Maori and the Hawaiian, there really aren't that many published studies of the health benefits. So it's a sparse literature, but it's an encouraging one. And so I want to go through what we found. And of course, as I'm sure you're all aware, Native American issues receive scarce attention in general. So that's also contributing to the small number of studies that we found. Before I really start talking about the studies themselves, I want to go over something that is a little bit challenging from a publishing point of view, which is that if we are trying to publish in mainstream publications, the definition of health is often simply assumed. And it's assumed to be a Western definition as health as absence of disease. And this is not really consistent with most native definitions of health. So the publications will be focused many times on a single disease. There are probably, 24 journals devoted to diabetes alone. Journals tend to start specializing, and so if you're talking about diabetes, then clearly the absence of diabetes is what interests you. This is not a good global definition of health, and indeed the World Health Organization has a more general definition. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So this is really promising. This is already something that takes a community attitude towards health as being important. And I think that it's consistent with what we see in native definitions. Darrell Baldwin, who was, of course, one of my co-authors, he's also on the board of directors for the Endangered Language Fund and the advisory board for the Healing Through Language Initiative, talks about this from a Biamia perspective, and he emphasizes that it's living well, properly, having awareness, wisdom, and knowledge. And there's a YouTube video of him on our website that has him discussing how he defines health. Another definition came out from the Pueblo convocation, which probably some of the participants are here. I haven't met them, but SWINA 2016 reports on this and says that one of the goals of the convocation was to encourage Pueblo people to think about health beyond current limited associations with physical health, illness, and seeking medical care at a local Indian Health Service facility. So indeed, just going beyond the deficit notion of health. And she summarized their discussion as having these 7 points: spirituality, community, family and children. Physical health is still there, of course. Traditional foods, very important as we just heard. Hard work and breastfeeding. So these are all elements of health that are, I think, quite obvious to people who take a community view. People who take a surgery and drug approach to health perhaps don't ever think about these issues. I had another quote from Gonzales 2015 that I found very useful. Each Native American community approaches health and wellness within the context of harmony among the physical body, the spiritual being, the community, and the land in which they live. And he points out further exactly what I've been saying. Historically, Western approaches to promoting wellness within Indian country have not fully grasped this concept and have only recently begun the process of developing trusting relations and engaging each Native American community to define wellness for itself rather than having it be defined for them. As Native American tribes are exercising their sovereignty and reclaiming their land rights, there is also a process underway to redeem cultural values as the foundation on which communities can begin to heal from the centuries of colonialization. So this is a very community-centric definition, and I think that all of you know the challenges of insisting on this definition, even as you're trying to benefit from the advances of Western medicine. Trying to balance the two of them is just another aspect of the biculturalism that I think most people are striving for. Another example comes from Canada. Anderson and Smiley report commonly stated elements of an Indigenous specific health measurement system included broad definitions of health, an increased focus on wellness, traditional elements, for example, use of traditional medicines, participation in traditional activities, midwifery, and using frameworks familiar to Indigenous people, such as the medicine wheel or the infinity symbol. So these are all aspects that I have certainly encountered in my years of talking about these issues with communities. The traditional elements are, of course, variable from community to community, which makes it a bit challenging to generalize, but I have found that whatever it is, the traditional elements have had great importance. Moorhead, Gahn in December, did a different survey in which they report the natural elements, songs, prayers, and holy sites were provided by the Creator, and relying on them is vital to the healing process. Without the proper protocol, ceremony, these elements are not at their full power. Traditional healing occurs when one is determined to be healthy. So in summary, all of these definitions have in common that they link health and wellness to the community, and often through spirituality. And this aspect of wellness is generally lacking in Western definitions of health. So relating wellness to the native understanding of the world is important. It has not worked very well, shall I say, to have Western ideas of health simply imposed on native communities. And even allowing participation in ceremonies is often restricted in institutional settings. Have any of you been kicked out of a hospital for trying to smudge? It can be awkward. These kinds of cultural impasses are something that will only be changed if we address them directly, I believe. So there are some implications of these definitions. So again, health and well-being are defined differently by different community. The ideal for implementing a wellness program is that these local definitions will be taken into account. This has the drawback that it makes it somewhat difficult to make generalizations across communities. So sometimes we have to ignore differences that we know are important in order to make generalizations, but I believe that generalizations are sometimes useful. And as I said before, the published studies necessarily in general take a Western definition of health because that's the only way you're going to get published in a mainstream publication. And we'll talk about some more implications of that later. So if we are going to assess our language program, what kind of data do we want? Published data in the mainstream publications and the scientific literature are generally quantitative. That is, scientists like myself want something that we can measure, and then we can report on the measurements. We can grind it up with a bunch of statistics that some people understand and other people don't. And those are the kinds of things that give us supposed replication and advances in science. Of course, any method has its limitations. The other kind of evidence, though, is called qualitative, which is people's experience, reported stories, things that aren't necessarily measurable. People who simply talk about how spirituality has changed their life, various stories about how things have improved without going about and measuring, did their blood pressure drop by 5 points or not? So some of those qualitative studies can be published, but it is both difficult, and qualitative studies are still, dare I say, second-class citizens in the scientific world. So it's a little bit challenging to be able to put all this together and make it clear that the qualitative evidence, which includes oral storytelling, as we just heard in the last talk, can take their rightful place. Alice Taff, with whom I've taught a course on wellness a couple of times, has what I think is a very nice description of this. Instead of using the term qualitative, she calls it eyewitness accounts. And this, I think, puts it in a very good frame of reference, because it's talking about, this is not just qualitative data that's kind of lying around. This is somebody reporting what they know. And people report things inaccurately sometimes, so it's not guaranteed to be right. But we take eyewitness very seriously, both legally and in our own experience. I think it's a really great term, instead of qualitative, calling it eyewitness accounts. Okay, so with all those asides out of the way, I'll get on to discussing the published results. So most of the published results, as I said, do in fact show an improvement in health due to either maintenance or revival of the native language. And again, similar effects are probably there for mental health, but I did not have the time, or dare I say energy, to do that as well. All studies have their limitations, and we'll discuss some of those. And there have been a few counterexamples that have appeared recently that perhaps are somewhat marginal in themselves, and we'll discuss those. So one of the most widely cited studies is Hallett, Chandler, and Lalonde, who found a reduction in the suicide rate as language use went up. Prime Minister Trudeau, in fact, referenced this self-same study in a recent address, further apologizing for mistreatment of First Nations peoples. The Hallett et al. Study looked at 7 different cultural factors: self-government, land claims, education, healthcare, cultural facilities, police and fire services, and finally language, to see how they affected suicide rates. Communities that had more of these factors had lower suicide rates, and we can see that in this graph here. And if I'm lucky, I can have a pointer. So is this showing up? Is my pointer showing up? Can't really see it. So the you can't really see this either, can you? So those communities that had none of these protective factors had a fairly high rate. As you added 1, 2, or 3, or 4, the rate tended to go down. As you can see, the final category here seemed to have an increase, and because the numbers start getting relatively small, that was a single suicide that made that rate look rather large. So sometimes when you look at percentages, you start thinking, oh, well, that's a lot, but actually that was just one event. So again, you have to be a little bit careful in interpreting published results. An Australian study found various youth risk factors were reduced by those who spoke their language. So there was a study of Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait Islanders with language use being one of the factors. And in the highlighted region, you can see that consuming alcohol was 8% versus 18% for language users versus not. Using illicit substances, 16% versus 26%. And being victims of physical or threatened violence in the last 12 months, 25% to 37%. Pretty horrendous numbers to begin with, but reduced by those who were speaking their language. Alice Taff had put these, a couple of these numbers into bar graph form, so it's a little easier to see. She also found the binge drinking in the past 2 weeks figure to be interesting, so 18% versus 34%. So these are pretty striking reductions, but simply putting those up as overall numbers is not really the way that most people talk about effectiveness of a particular treatment. They talk about reducing the rate from one rate to another. And if we do that, if we talk about how much of a reduction there was, suddenly these numbers look a whole lot more impressive. 55.6% reduction, 32.4% reduction, 38.5, 47.1. These are really substantial reductions in all of these different domains. And remember, these are all the same kids with different risk factors, and all the risk factors were reduced. So the language use was having an effect on a broad range of risk factors in this particular study. So, you know, an epidemiological study that finds a 50% reduction in something has really latched on to something significant. Various language programs have shown improved graduation rates. You might not necessarily think of graduation rates as being a health indicator, but the National Institutes of Health, in fact, treat it as such. There is some conflict between traditionalism and formal schooling, as we've heard before. So it's not totally clear that graduating from high school is always a positive thing for cultural continuity. Nonetheless, it is something in a bicultural world that tends to be quite useful for success. Success tends to lead to better health. 100% of the Hualapai bilingual students that were studied by Watamahiji in 1995 graduated from high school. 2001 Canadian Aboriginal Peoples Survey. I'll show you a figure next that shows improved outcomes. The Hawaiian program basically had a 100% graduation rate. At first I thought this was a little bit suspect because people can choose to go into the Hawaiian immersion program. So if the really good students choose to go into the program and they graduate, that's not too surprising. But Pila Wilson assures me that almost everybody in Hawaii who could afford to go to private school still went to private school. And so these were mostly students who would be compared to other Native Hawaiians in the public schools who tended to have about a 60% graduation rate. So it was a huge difference in graduation rates for the Hawaiians. Lakota students in a positive leadership workshop. Again, this may be more focused on culture than language. All graduated as compared to 72%. And Darrell Baldwin has reported that there are higher graduation rates for those Miami tribal members who go to the University of Ohio, the University of Miami, Ohio, who do partake in the Miami culture program than those who do not. So this is the Canadian result here. They've broken it up between Inuit, First Nations, other First Nations students on reserves, and then First Nations who are off the reserves. They just had a probability of doing well in school. I don't remember exactly how they define that. But for those who speak the language, whether or not the teachers are particularly supportive, they do better than those students who don't speak the language. That's true for the Inuits and the on-reserve students. For the off-reserve, probably mostly urban, there was no effect. As I'm sure you're all aware, once you get into the urban environment, there are all sorts of confusing factors involved. A recent study by Oster et al. In 2011 found a reduction in the rates of diabetes, and that's shown here. For those of you who may not be that familiar with statistics, an adjusted R-square of 0.21 is really quite significant. I mean, it's not just that the p-value, for those of you who like p-values, is really low. But the language spoken accounts for a fair amount of the variability. And I forgot to mention for the Whalen et al. Study that they were able to factor out language as a factor by itself, and it really was the language by itself that was the factor that was contributing the most of those 7 cultural factors. So knowing the language resulted in lower rates of diabetes. No one is claiming that if you speak your language, your diabetes is going to go away. That's not the way it works. This is not necessarily just a cure by speaking. It's whatever else is going on in the environment when you're speaking and other cultural changes that you might have made that lowers diabetes. Still, the language comes out as a protective factor. Oops. There's some slight evidence that is more tangentially related to language about reduction in smoking. High levels of traditionalism among Hopi women was found to reduce smoking by Coe et al. 2004. Pretty much traditionalism included a bunch of different things, but it did include language use. As I said, this one's a little more tangential, but there was a higher misuse of tobacco in the plains than there was in the Southwest, and this does correlate with overall higher language use in the Southwest than in the plains. So that one's a bit of a stretch, but still consistent with the notion that language use is a protective factor. Obesity is also something that has been shown to show improvements. Again, from the Hopi study, those high levels of traditionalism also showed reduced rates of obesity. So again, I keep trying to emphasize that these correlations show up for multiple risk factors all at once. It's not that you're designing something to combat obesity and you succeed. Here you're designing a language program and you're addressing many risk factors all at once. But of course it is something where if we find a way of separating out the unique contribution of language, then that's all to the good. Then there are some studies that just talk about overall improvements of health. The California American Indian reported good health on average, more often with language use than without. There was a fairly complex study done in Greenland, Alaska, and Norway that pretty much showed improved health, but the results were actually so complicated I couldn't figure out how to summarize them. So you can read the article yourself if you're really interested. 3 Canadian populations show greater resilience with language use, and resilience did lead to better health. And higher use of indigenous languages in Mexico led to a lower risk factor for breast cancer. Fairly, to me at least, surprising direct physical link with language use. As I said, there are a few recent studies that seem to offer some negative effects of language programs. And I think it's important to deal with the negative evidence as well as the positive evidence. As I said, there's not much negative evidence, but these are the 3 studies that I found, mostly dealing with Canadian survey data. Probably many of you have dealt with survey data before, and you know that it's kind of full of mistakes and misleading things, so you have to take survey data with a grain of salt. But for example, there was more obesity in Métis children when they spoke their language, but only 5.9% of the individuals in that study spoke the language. So it's a really small sample and hard to take too seriously. Smoking increased with language use among the Inuit. But even the authors say that this may in fact be tied more to traditionalism and traditional use of tobacco rather than abuse of tobacco. And then the Canadian Indigenous Youth Survey found numerically higher use of tobacco use for those Canadian youth that spoke their language. But even the authors say that it wasn't a significant difference. And again, if you're into statistics, you know that if it's not significant, even if you see a numerical difference, you're not supposed to take it seriously. So I don't think this is really a counterexample at all. So I wanted to mention epigenetics since we heard about it today. And many of the challenges that communities face have clearly persisted for generations, and the recent discovery of various epigenetic effects is indeed quite interesting and opens up all sorts of avenues for study. And I think that there is a strong possibility that it's going to show persistent effects. The trouble for me, for this particular evidence, I mean, humans are hard to study. We can't quite do the same things to humans that we do to mice. So we can't just take a bunch of humans and knock out some of their genes and make them reproduce. So it gets really complicated to study. But many of the traumatic events that happened in the past, I am sad to say, as you all know, are persisting into the current day. So high levels of poverty, high levels of abuse, high levels of discrimination, they're all still present. And if the things that you're looking for epigenetically still have their causes present in the current generation, then you can't tell epigenetics from current cultural situations. So it's vastly interesting, and I hope that the research continues. I think it's likely to be true that epigenetic effects are real, but I think that it's going to be really hard to sort them out from the current environmental effects that we have. So if language helps overcome epigenetic effects, that's terrific. Especially because that means future generations won't have as many negative inclinations as current generations. But if language works for other reasons, that's good too. So I talked about, so that's pretty much the wrap up of what we were able to find for quantitative data. I did want to talk a little bit about some of the eyewitness accounts that we've started generating recently. Well, some of them not so recent. Leanne Hinton talks about some of her experiences with the masters in the Master Apprentice program. So Master Apprentice was named a long time ago when it didn't seem quite so loaded a term. But anyway, in these pairings, you kind of think that you're focusing on the apprentice as the one who's benefiting, but it turns out that the teachers are also known to benefit. So Leanne says, the positive benefits to the self-esteem of the elders themselves are often notable. Sometimes elders even tell us they are getting better health reports from their doctors lately, which they attribute to their work with their apprentices. So simply working on the language can have health benefits. So a report from, if I get this right, Tipiziwan Tolman on Lakota talks about when you're healthy, you raise the health of the people around you, and I think that language does that for a person. It's a proven path to a better life in terms of finding out who you are, feeling that connection to relatives who came before you. I see huge changes in the kids, and I see it affect and influence their personalities and identities because they completely and fully believe that they're supposed to speak their language and that they're supposed to pray and that they're supposed to be Lakota people in and outside of the classroom. So these are observations of a single person. You would be really hard pressed to quantify anything that she said there, but it's still very powerful. In one of the classes that Alice Taff and I taught at COLANG, the Collaborative Language Institute, this one I guess was the one in Fairbanks, we had one student, J.C. Hull, who's a Tutuni and a Ph.D. student at the University of Oregon, and she was describing how her experience was that she had to improve her health before she even started the language. That she needed to get herself clean because she knew that in her current state she would not be able to do the hard work of language learning. And she concludes by saying, I seek out balance with the conscious thought that I am working on this language and I have this responsibility, and if I treat myself badly, then I'm treating this language badly. If I treat myself badly, then the spirits might know and maybe they won't talk to me, maybe they won't give me their advice. So this was an aspect of the healing that I hadn't thought about personally, and it's one that, again, is going to be extremely hard to quantify because it's something that actually happens before the language program is even entered. So it's something else to think about. I'm a linguist. I do boring stuff all the time. Language documentation often strikes people as really boring and perhaps pointless. I think it's quite valuable. We've run the Breath of Life workshops in Washington, D.C., where people have found amazing things in the archives that were never intended to be used, to be honest. So I think even sometimes overly academic research can be quite useful. Dale McCreary is a linguistics student at the University of Victoria, and he found some effects just from doing the documentation. I've had more than one elder show clear signs of reversing mental aging, for want of a better word, having their short-term memories improve and the like. Beatrice Elliott in particular went from constantly falling asleep while recording, constantly forgetting the question or topic being discussed, and her family widely considered to being already going into dementia or already being in dementia, to the point 6 months later, she translated an entire story she'd never heard before in one go before I could even start repeating it sentence by sentence. And she had entirely stopped losing her train of thought while recording, stopped nodding off, was always focused in there. And these abilities have extended into the entire rest of her life, where her family and friends and those who have known her thought considered to have woken up again. And I've heard several similar stories from people that have worked with elders who seem to be failing. And I think we do forget sometimes that sometimes dementia is just boredom. And having a new purpose can really change things around. So, as I said, publishing eyewitness accounts is difficult. It's something that the academic literature is not fond of. And because these are eyewitness accounts, they don't quantify at all. So it's challenging to get those published. I do think it's valuable to start recording some of these in whatever venues are available to you. So stories in your tribal newsletter, in blogs, wherever, because once they get out there in some kind of citable form, even if the citation is to something that's kind of not in the academic world, then we can start pulling all these things together. And the way in which eyewitness accounts start have weight and can be published is when there are enough of them that the same story is told over and over again. So I would encourage you to try to record as many of these eyewitness accounts as you can. So I wanted to talk about some of the cautionary notes about interpreting this data. The first thing is, as I kind of mentioned with the diabetes study, correlation is not causation. This is probably familiar as a saying to most of you. But it just means that if something happens together, that doesn't necessarily mean that it caused it. Alice Taft's favorite example is people bring out umbrellas when it rains, therefore umbrellas cause rain. Well, I don't think any of us really believe that, but it's definitely a correlation. So separating out the causation is quite challenging, but it's challenging for every epidemiological study, not just for language. So we do need to separate that out. With language, we have the extra complication that language is so intimately tied up with culture that is quite difficult to separate out, whether it's the language or language and the culture or just the culture. I think there's enough evidence to say that it kind of doesn't matter, that language is really good for sustaining the culture. So maybe that doesn't really matter. As a scientist, I do want to know, comparing tribes that might have a culture revival versus ones that have language and culture revival might be one way to find out. Maybe one is more successful than the other. But when you start comparing programs, you need lots of examples because it's hard to know sometimes whether just one or two examples is really telling you the full story. Nonetheless, I think that the evidence is strong enough to say that we should pursue language as a health benefit. In order to follow this up, I started a program through the Endangered Language Fund called Healing Through Language. This initiative is there to provide more evidence for this so that we can convince more and more funders that this is worth doing and convince more and more funders that supporting the language programs themselves is worthwhile and an effective way of improving health. So here's just one screenshot, again, of the video that Daryl Baldwin produced for us. So that's out there and you can listen to that. Here's our advisory board, which, as is my general attitude towards dealing with these kinds of issues, is a mixture of native and non-native folks, academics mostly, and native activists. So what we hope to do with this initiative is to raise more money for the work, both the studying of the effectiveness of programs and supporting the programs themselves. And we do hope that this is going to help make it easier to find funding for the language programs, either through tribal or non-tribal sources. If you want to try to have your program be one of our case studies, we can talk about that during the breakout sessions this afternoon. I'd be happy to discuss that. We've had a couple of studies that got 60% of the way towards completion and then fizzled out for various reasons, so it's time to restart some more. The Endangered Language Fund does have 2 grant programs. The Native Voices Endowments is for the Lewis and Clark the languages of tribes that were contacted by the Lewis and Clark expedition. This is somewhat more sizable. It's up to $10,000 per year for up to 3 years. We also have the Language Legacies grants, which are for all the other languages of the world, and those tend to average about $2,500. And these dollar amounts are not really enough to do any kind of assessment of a language program. So I wanted to talk a little bit about evaluating programs and why I think it's worth doing. It's, as I've said throughout, I think it's essential for convincing Western funders that this is really something to do. And that a 50% reduction in health risks is really worth pursuing. There are, though, I mean, as I said, I try to be balanced. There are plenty of reasons not to evaluate. I keep talking about funding because evaluations are expensive. And if you don't have money for expense, then it's not going to happen. It may be too soon to evaluate a program. As I said, even the ones that have been around for 30 years have not been well evaluated. Evaluations take effort, oftentimes from the very people who are running the programs, who are already overcommitted. And then there are sometimes concerns that the data will be misused. Pueblo Wilson refused to examine the Hawaiian immersion programs during the No Child Left Behind days because of its English-only aspect. So given that it's expensive, we should look for places that can fund this. It might be possible to use A&A for grants for this. I'm not very familiar with A&A grants since I'm not eligible for them. I get the impression that they only want to do immersion programs, and I'm not sure if evaluating the health effects of those immersion programs would be of interest to them, but perhaps some of you know better. What I do know is the National Institutes of Health. I've been getting funding from them for the past 30 years, so I'm rather familiar with them. This is NIH. It's called the Institutes because it is in fact made up of a bunch of different fairly autonomous institutes. The most relevant ones for us would be Child Health and Human Development, NICHD. This is the government. They love acronyms, so you get kind of used to seeing them around. Deafness and Other Communicative Disorders, NIDCD, where I get most of my money. Minority Health and Health Disparities, and nursing research. Across all the institutes, and this includes cancer and all sorts of other institutes, but that's $7.2 billion were awarded in 2017 for research. So that's a bit of money. So here's the website of NICHD. So Child Health and Human Development, as you might imagine, covers quite a range of topics. It might not be totally obvious that literacy is a fairly big one of those, and for those who are trying to develop literacy in their own languages, this could be a really interesting source of funding. Many of the program officers have expressed direct interest in American Indian issues, and it's not easy to apply to NIH, so they haven't seen a lot of applications. NICHD has pretty miserable funding rates. Lately it's been around 8%, very depressing. When I worked at NSF, I went there saying that I was there to give away money, and then I looked, and statistically speaking, I was there to not give away money. So it can be challenging. NIDCD, again, may not be totally obvious, but they don't just work with disabilities, they also do basic research, and they do a lot of work on second language acquisition. And this is highly relevant to figuring out what's going on. Language acquisition, when there's not a large pool of native speakers, is different, I'm sure you'll agree, than learning a language where there are lots of native speakers. And we really don't understand the differences and just how to go about doing this. DCD has had better funding rates, about 14% lately, but still very challenging to get. NIMHD, the Minority and Health Disparities Institute, is relatively new. That also means new institutes tend to have small budgets, but they do have a pretty decent funding rate of about 22%. They do have a lot of specific requests, looking at health disparities in diabetes, et cetera. But they do have this one call that's quite general, that just asks for, how can we reduce health disparities among Native Americans? So revitalization programs could end up in that. I've had some conversations with a program officer at this institute and found some positive encouragement, but haven't yet been able to apply. The Nursing Institute may also be a possibility. I was trying to get a proposal together for them until I saw that their funding rate was about 9%, and I said, maybe I'll try somebody else. But anyway, nursing, as you know, is often the first line of healthcare in this country, so it could be really important. So I'm just going to quickly go through a recent call for proposals that is quite relevant and might even be something that people would want to work up towards. NIH each institute has general calls like I showed you for the Health Disparities Institute, but then there are also some calls that are specific to a topic that are signed on to by multiple institutes. And I'm going to show you an example of one of those. I'm going to show you the first 2 pages of the call, and that leaves off 20 or 30 other pages because, well, life is short and it gets really boring. So this is the intervention research to improve Native American health, which is, as you can gather, quite relevant to what we're talking about. R01 is another wonderful government acronym. It's a research grant, so it's an R, it's O1, investigator initiated. You probably don't want to know about that. Those of you who are looking at the next little bit, clinical trial optional, I'm sure for those of you who have never had an NIH grant, that means nothing. We could spend at least an hour talking just about clinical trial optional, but we don't have an hour, thank goodness. It's a really horrible topic. And then here's the second page of this. And I'm showing you this not so that you read it. You don't want to read all that, but just because it takes a long time to get used to what we call NIH speak. And to be able to read through these program announcements and figure out what they really want, figure out what's really going to be successful, and figure out what you really have to do. It is complicated, and it's something where I hope that academics can team up with community members to end up with a successful application. Most tribes are eligible to apply for NIH grants directly. They don't have to have an academic involved. Your chances of success, if you've never had an NIH grant, are, I'm sad to say, almost non-existent. They really typically want to give only to people who have had it before. You may say, well, that's a paradox, and you're right, but that's still the way they operate. So I think, though, that it is quite possible to have academics and community members come together and to get through to NIH and start generating some serious funds for evaluating language programs. So here are my recommendations. These are just me. If you plan to study health outcomes, look to health organizations for funding. Don't go to your cultural department, and look at federal and foundational sources. If your tribal government has a health department, consider going to them for your language program. Don't undersell your program. If your program has huge health benefits, tout them. Tell your government that they can't afford not to fund the language program. How could you have a 50% reduction in smoking, in drug use, in teen pregnancy, all from a single program? I think these programs are great bargains. And don't listen to the naysayers. Remember Dower Cup. Thank you.